So this is basically Book Expo 2.0, and we've got Dr. Ed Kelly from the University of Virginia who's going to be speaking today. You can see him in the number 4 slot from the original event. Unfortunately, neither Aileen Simmons nor Ed were able to speak, so we'll have Aileen tomorrow at noon. So I'm going to read Ed's bio and then get out of the way. So this is me reading it into the record. So Dr. Edward F. Kelly is a research professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences at the University of Virginia, with interest in psychical research and functional neuroimaging. He is the lead author of 3 previous books: Computer Recognition of English Word Senses, Altered States of Consciousness and Psi, and Historical Survey and Research Perspective, and Irreducible Mind Towards the Psychology for the 21st Century. The new book, Beyond Physicalism Toward Reconciliation of Science and Spirituality, was edited by Ed and Dr. Adam Crabtree and Dr. Paul Marshall, and it contains chapters by the following: Dr. Harold Ottensbacher, Dr. Lorelei Bernanke, Professor Bernard Carr, Wolfgang Fox, Dr. Michael Grosso, Michael Murphy, Dr. David E. Presti, Dr. Gregory Shaw, Dr. Henry Staff, Dr. Eric Weiss, and Dr. Ian Witcher. Some of these folks will be well known to those of you who studied the serious literature in parapsychology, and others from physics and philosophy and so on. Dr. Jeffrey Kreipel, who is the J. Newton Razor Professor of Religious Studies at Rice University, wrote the following about the book: Beyond Physicalism is much more than a book. It is the intimate expression of a decade and a half of critical but collegial conversations between established scientists and professional humanists around some of the most important but still unsettled questions for facing humanity, those involving the nature of mind or consciousness, that is, the nature of us. The Beyond Physicalism received a Parapsychological Association Book Award in 2015, and we're absolutely delighted to have Ed here to speak in the Parapsychology Foundation Book Expo. These are his two, get my pointer, these are his 2 editorial colleagues, Dr. Adam Crabtree from Canada and Dr. Paul Marshall. And Lizette Coley is sending her blessings and delight that we're finally going to get to hear from Ed. She unfortunately had some other things she needed to be doing today, so it's just Carlos in the chat and me moderating. And let me move over 1 slide. And Ed, I'm going to get out of your way, and it's all yours.
Okay. This is quite an odd experience, I must say, talking to a composite video-audio device and having no real sense of who I'm talking to or how you're reacting to what I say. Anyway, my job is to tell you about this, and to do that, really, as Nan has already indicated, I have to tell you something about this, and the whole kind of 15-year process that led to these 2 books. And at the same time, I'd like to put it even in a somewhat bigger context and tell you a bit about my own trajectory through all this material, because these 2 books really have altered how I see the world myself in a way that I think is probably pertinent to many of you and many of our colleagues. So let's start with the concept of physicalism. What does that mean? Well, there are lots of subtly different varieties of it, but the basic idea is what we all learned in high school, for example, that reality consists at bottom of little hard bits of stuff, self-existent stuff that'll be there whether we're there or not, moving around in fields of force under the influence of mathematical laws. And everything has to come from that somehow. And in particular, everything in mind and consciousness must be generated by physiological processes occurring in our brains. And of course, if that's the truth of the matter, lights out, nothing else can happen, because the basis for mind and consciousness is now gone. Well, I certainly not up believing all that. I mean, this is the product of 3 centuries or so of scientific development. It seems to make a lot of sense in many contexts. It certainly produced all kinds of good stuff that we can use in our daily lives. Seems to lend you credibility to the whole system. And certainly, most people working in psychology and neuroscience, behavioral and social sciences, take for granted something like that as the basically true story of how things are. I certainly did as a graduate student. I mean, when I came up in graduate school in the 1960s, we were just really in the process of shaking off the dark ages of behaviorism. And, the computational theory of the mind had recently burst onto the scene. Chomsky had written his destructive review of B.F. Skinner's book on verbal behavior. There was a kind of euphoria in Cambridge at that time, where I was in graduate school. We thought the promised land was at hand, basically, and I swallowed that completely. I thought the computational theory of the mind was the greatest thing since sliced bread. Anyway, fast forward about 6 years or so, I'm now working on my dissertation, which had to do with getting computers to distinguish the main senses of high-frequency words in English. And a long story to be told there, and it's all told in Chapter 4 of my book on computer recognition of English word senses. But the long and short of it was that in a situation where I got to see a lot about the behavior of individual words in an unusual sort of way, where they're all together in one space, I became convinced that the computational theory of the mind was going to fail. That nothing in sight in linguistics at that time was going to enable a computer systematically to distinguish between literal falsehood and metaphorical truth. That's a kind of complicated statement, and the justification for it is really Chapter 4 of that book. But anyway, to me it was profoundly disheartening. The euphoria was gone for me already at that point, so I'm sort of sitting there trying to finish my dissertation, in the slough of despair and all that. And right about that time, I got a phone call from my mother one day. And she wanted to tell me that a female relative of ours had become a medium. And she obviously thought that since I was a graduate student in psychology, I'd know what that meant and could reassure her that there was nothing to worry about. Well, of course, I didn't have any idea what she was talking about. But I went over to Widener Library, and there I discovered to my amazement that William James, one of my great intellectual heroes, had spent a sizable part of his adult life studying things like mediumship. Also discovered several shelves of books, the Journal of Parapsychology, the Journal of the SPR and Proceedings, and so on. So I began to read sort of in the background as I was finishing my dissertation, and got more and more interested in the subject. I mean, like many people who come into parapsychology, I think we start by either having some kind of experience, which I never really did, or by becoming sufficiently acquainted with the subject to develop the sense that, hey, if the standard model, let's call it, is true, this stuff shouldn't be happening, yet there seems to be a lot of significant evidence that it is happening. What does it mean? Anyway, so I started corresponding with J.B. Ryan at that point, and to make a long story short, finished my dissertation, did a postdoc year in computational linguistics, then went down to work for J.B. for the usual, $400 a month, 6-month trial period deal. And I had been there, about 2 months, I guess, when I had the incredible good fortune to meet a guy who was undoubtedly one of the best subjects ever to appear in a parapsychology laboratory. That was Bill Gilmore. There was a bunch of our papers about him in the JP and the Jasper from, say, 1972 to 75 or so in particular. But to make a long story short, he basically erased any lingering doubts that I had about the reality of psi phenomena. And I have never wavered from that conviction since then. But I was still very deeply influenced by the standard model. And like most people, I think, most scientists anyhow, I continue to have the hope that maybe a few little tweaks here and there in the standard model would enable it to kind of draw in all these other phenomena. The one really conspicuous exception seemed to be evidence for survival. And of course, that evidence is itself controversial. I've developed a modest acquaintance with the subject during that period of time. This is the early to mid-70s now. But wasn't convinced, found it interesting, and that was pretty much it. Okay, then I had to go off on a long detour for a while. I worked in somatosensory neuroscience at UNC Chapel Hill for about a dozen years. But in 1998, a big event occurred. And this involved Michael Murphy and the Center for Theory and Research at Esalen. Mike, you may know, was the co-founder of Esalen, and he's the head of the Center for Theory and Research. He's an absolutely extraordinary guy. He's read vast amounts of stuff and seems to remember everything, to mobilize it at a moment's notice. In any case, he's one of the few people who had read all of F.W.H. Myers' Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death, published in 1903. 2 volumes. Great book in the history of psychical research. And he was more generally familiar with a good bit of the evidence for survival and so on. And he was acutely aware that if the standard model is correct, there can be no survival. So he decided he would convene a group of people involved in the study of survival in one way or another and discuss that evidence. That's how we started. This was 1998. Several of our folks from the Division of Perceptual Studies and then Personality Studies at UVA attended the initial meetings, and most of us have continued right on through. What started out as a single meeting gradually evolved. Basically what happened was we spent the first 2 meetings, these are like 5-day meetings that occur once a year. And after the second meeting, we realized that we all agreed that physicalism is false. Not just incomplete, but false. And that what we needed to do was a great big task doing, and it had 2 main parts. The first was to try to assemble in one place much of the existing empirical evidence indicating the falsehood of physicalism. So we worked on that for 7 years, 8 years really, finished the book, Irreducible Mind, in the summer of 2006. And what it deals with, starts with psychical research and psi phenomena, and takes the view in the introduction that the existence of these phenomena is really established for anybody who's willing to look seriously at the evidence. And that's kind of the sharp end of the wedge, because all of that stuff, as McDougall had realized 100 years before, disputes the correctness of physicalism, or materialism as it was then known. So we didn't want to get into a lengthy presentation and discussion of the evidence for psi, but we sort of incorporated by reference and have a big annotated bibliography at the back of the book to introduce persons otherwise unfamiliar with the subject to it. And it includes both parapsychology in general and evidence for survival and some of the critical debates and so on. And then we refer to it from time to time throughout the book. But we talked about a lot of other things as well. For example, extreme psychophysiological influence. My wife Emily has chapter 3 in Irreducible Mind, in which she, in a sort of Myers-like way, lays out progressively greater challenges for the conventional view of things in the form of psychophysiological effects that become increasingly difficult to explain in terms of any known physiology. So she starts with sort of generic placebo effects, but then moves into things like stigmata, in which persons reproduce on their bodies somehow what seem to them like the wounds of Christ and so on. hypnotic blisters, especially blisters of detailed geometric shape, skin writing, hold recall, things of that sort. And we talked also about maternal impression cases, and of course then there's quite a big literature on PK, where there seems to be direct mental influence on the physical world. Okay, then we talk about lots of other things. Adam Crabtree has an excellent chapter in that book about phenomena of psychological automatisms and phenomena such as multiple personality, major dissociative type phenomena. And these are situations in which it looks as though the same organism is being somehow inhabited by multiple personalities going about their business, some aware of others but not vice versa. There are a lot of strange properties of these cases that are extremely difficult to reconcile with the standard kind of picture of a brain as a mind as being embodied in a brain, which is organized as a set of modules invoked to carry out tasks in a sort of sequential way. That's chapter 5. Chapter 6 is about particularly near-death experiences and related stuff, OBEs and so on, but focusing especially on what to me are the most interesting type of such cases, ones where people are having dramatic experiences under conditions where the best contemporary neuroscience says they shouldn't be able to have any experiences whatsoever, let alone experiences that transform their lives. So these involve, for example, NDEs occurring under conditions such as deep general anesthesia and or cardiac arrest. Then we also have chapters on genius. And I should say, by the way, that in structuring the thing, we were self-consciously trying to revisit Myers' book in light of the subsequent century of research in psychology and neuroscience. So we had a chapter on genius, and the argument made by us as well as by Myers is that in its highest expressions, genius looks extremely difficult to reconcile with the standard model, although we, like Myers, recognize that it's very hard to make that argument in the context of genius alone. But when you take genius in the context of all these other things, it becomes more plausible to look at it in that way. And then we had a final chapter on mystical experience, basically revisiting that subject mainly from the standpoint of William James's original exposition of the varieties of religious experience. Okay, so then in the final chapter of Irreducible Mind, we took a first stab at trying to think through whether a James-like transmission theory could be seen as compatible with contemporary neuroscience and physics. You know, James's idea was that the correlation, which everybody accepts, between brain activity and aspects of mental experience can be interpreted in a way quite different from the standard model. You know, the standard model says the experience is generated by the physiological processes in the brain. The transmission model essentially says that we're having experiences that are somehow conditioned by physical activities in the brain, but not produced by those activities. And in Irreducible Mind, I think we made a pretty good case to the effect that you can view the mind-brain relation in that way without violating anything we know at present about neuroscience or physics. In fact, surprisingly, some developments in physics directly suggest a picture of that sort. In particular, at that time, I had just encountered the work of Berkeley quantum theorist Henry Stapp, who comes right out and says that in his view, quantum mechanics entails a kind of dualism. He has other ideas too, but that shocked me. Anyway, okay, so we finished Irreducible Mind. It was published in 2007. Actually, I've got to be careful here that I don't yak too long. I want to make sure we have time for some interactions. In a way, I hate to say it, it's a great, huge book. That was the easy part. I mean, that was a gigantic clerical task, and we had lots of help in trying to pull the pieces together. But now we come to the much more difficult question. Okay, let's say that we've established as I think we did, that physicalism is false. What is to take its place? That's a much tougher theoretical question. Anyway, so we continued to meet out at Esalen once a year. We began to load up with additional people. I mean, we altered the composition of our group in such a way as to have several very good representatives of contemporary physics. Henry Stapp, I mentioned, is the quantum theorist from Berkeley, who has a well-developed theory of the mind-brain connection and an openness to psi and related things. Harold Ottmansbacher is a buddy of Henry's who has spent a lot of time in the literature pertaining to the interaction between Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli. A huge subject, a lot of it's still unpublished. I mean, it's published in German, not translated. We also recruited Bernard Carr as a cosmologist from the UK, and comes at the whole subject from the relativity side of things, cosmology. Then we also got a bunch of scholars of religion on board, representing mystically informed religious philosophies. And the central kind of methodological point here is that what we wanted to do was to begin looking at serious theoretical proposals which depart from the understanding that these various world phenomena are for real and are going to have to be accounted for somehow, and to look and see whether to begin to see common features and trends in these wildly diverse approaches to the subject. So we had our physicists, and we had our scholars of religion. We have a guy in Neoplatonism. I worked with a scholar of Patanjali to study the Yoga Sutras and related stuff. And Lorelei Bernacki is an expert on the 11th century Kashmiri Shaivist Abhinavagupta. Then we had several philosophers as well. Adam was very involved with Charles Sanders Peirce. Paul Marshall is a keen student of Leibniz. And Eric Weiss is a Whiteheadian who thinks that he's been able to pull together Whitehead with some things coming from the Hindu mystical philosopher Aurobindo, contemporary. So beyond physicalism also took a long time to put together, mainly because of its theoretical kind of density and complexity. Basically, we milled around for several years talking through all these things, and we got to the point, we hoped initially, that we might ourselves arrive at some final grand proposal about a proper metaphysics. And I should say here, by the way, that, the word metaphysics is kind of a bugaboo among many scientists, but it's not really a question of whether there's going to be metaphysics or not. It's a question of whether there's going to be good metaphysics or bad metaphysics. And the whole point of Irreducible Mind is that most of mainstream contemporary science is grounded in a bad metaphysics of which people are hardly conscious most of the time. It's had definite philosophical defenders in modern times. But by the way, I should mention that Harold Ottmansbacher in particular really keeps his ear to the ground about these things, goes to a lot of meetings with a friend of his, whose name I can't remember at the moment, from Toronto. And they report, and I've seen other reports like this, that in the world of philosophy of mind, physicalism is now really in free fall worldwide. People are becoming very disenchanted with it, and the question that more and more people are beginning to raise is what's to take its place. So I think we're actually somewhat in the thick of things in terms of where it's all headed. And I won't attempt to sketch for you what's in the individual chapters because there's a lot of it. It's really complicated. But just to cut quickly to the bottom line, and then maybe we can start having a conversation. My personal view is that when we take psi phenomena seriously and all the related things, we cataloged an irreducible mind, in particular, the world's mystical traditions and the kind of perennialist side of that whole literature, which seems to speak to powerful experiences from which people feel they learn things about the nature of reality, and which bring with them often psi-type experiences and abilities and so on. You are propelled away from classical physicalism inevitably into metaphysical territory that has traditionally been occupied by the world's religious traditions, with their often conflicting beliefs and very mixed historical records. I mean, we certainly see a lot of that going on right now. That has a lot of hazards, of course. I mean, we're getting out into a sort of no man's land where we're being fired on from all sides simultaneously. But I think we have actually, through beyond physicalism, planted a flag out in the direction that science itself will inevitably move in the coming decades. And that will help to give meaning to a lot of people's lives. I mean, there are a lot of people out there, and myself included, I have to say, who have abandoned any traditional kind of spiritual belief, have some kind of a general sense of things in that area, but don't belong to any kind of organized religion or anything like that. And I think lots of people are struggling with the conflicts between what they grew up with and what they have gotten from contemporary science. And I think we can begin to see how those conflicts can be reduced and something fundamentally spiritual can be salvaged that's also consistent with science. So that's how I see it all going. And maybe, shall we stop here and talk? I can barely see the screen. I'm half blind anyhow.
Sure. If you want to go on for a few more minutes, I can also extend the session. We do have some questions coming in. The first one is from Shirley Black. She says, so Ed, when someone asks you as a psychologist about mediums now, what do you tell them?
Well, I personally think that the traditional literature about mediumship is one of the most interesting and strongest parts of our entire evidential base. Not too many people these days go back and read, for example, Hodgson's second report on Mrs. Piper or Eleanor Sidgwick's report on the Piper mediumship. And there are several others in that category, including Eileen Garrett, who's behind what we're doing today. And some of this stuff, I have to say, is really fantastic and hair-raising almost at times. The quality of it was really extraordinary. Now, is it still going on today? That's a more difficult question. We certainly have not found it easy to find mediums that are anything like of that quality. And there's lots of stuff going on under the level of channeling, which is more like psychic readings and things like that. I should maybe mention here something Ian Stevenson told me once. This was back in the 1970s. He said he had had past life readings by something like 100 psychics up to that point, no two of which agreed on any significant detail. So there's plenty of noise, shall we say, out there, but I firmly believe that mediumship must be some kind of a biological capacity that we probably all have to some degree, and some people to a very conspicuous degree. But you have to be careful who you're dealing with, because there's really lots of self-delusion and manipulation and all that kind of stuff going on as well.
Any more questions? Brian, Margaret, I know you were typing, and Shirley is typing again. Shirley says, what about PK, macro PK? Do you think there's any decent evidence for that?
What an opportunity. I think it's been about 10 days. Mike Grosso's new book on Joseph of Cupertino will be released by Rowman and Littlefield. Joseph of Cupertino was a 17th century Catholic saint, 17th century Catholic monk who later became a saint. in a very elaborate canonization process, and those canonization things were big deals for the Catholic Church, very tough, much like secular trials. Lots of people gave sworn depositions about what they saw, only 30 years or so prior. The long and short of it is that this guy was witnessed on hundreds of occasions by literally thousands of people doing very unsubtle things like rising 30 meters in the air and hanging up there for minutes at a time. Lots of other stuff. Mike reports on all this in his book, which is called The Man Who Could Fly. It'll be out in roughly 10 days. And he also, Mike certainly acknowledges that this is pretty hair-raising stuff and way beyond the norm, but it's not completely isolated either. Joseph is really the most extreme of a number of cases, many of which come from the history of psychical research involving mediums like David Hume and Irreducible. So yes, I personally think that macro PK cannot be denied without denying virtually anything that depends on human testimony. And while some people will make that kind of a move, it just doesn't hold water in this context. Now, we have not really done very well in terms of bringing it into the laboratory, but that's something that our group here, we're interested in neuroimaging studies of people succeeding in various kinds of psi tasks. And somebody who could do macro PK would be of extreme interest to us.
Margaret Lublin is asking, what did you think about the Bohm? What do you think about the Bohm-Edgar Mitchell theories about holographic process and consciousness?
I'd have to admit that I'm not terribly familiar with that. I take my cue really from Henry Stapp. Henry Lublin, and he interacted with all these guys. If you can believe this, he was a postdoctoral fellow with both Pauli and Heisenberg. This is back in the late 40s and early 50s. And he knew Bohm and his theories very well. And Henry, actually in his book, No Matter and Quantum Mechanics, goes into some detail about what he regards as phototechnical problems in those on the quantum mechanics side. In terms of, holographic this and that, of course, I had some dealings myself with Carl Krugman back in the old days. I don't really think it explains very much of anything. Certainly nothing on the PK side, and it's just a kind of reproductive informational side mechanism. I don't think quantum holography is any better than classical holography in that respect. And the whole subject has been somewhat destructively reviewed, I think, by Steve Dowdy in a series of articles. I don't have them right to hand, but you could probably look those up and find them. I can't tell you off the top of my head where to find those, but he's done a pretty thorough hatchet job on all of that. So I guess my sympathies are more with Henry than the Bohm slant on quantum mechanics. On the other hand, of course, we all have to appreciate that the proper metaphysical interpretation of quantum mechanics is still very much up for grabs. Lots of people have very different views, and there are lots of physicists who would go to any length to avoid talking about consciousness. One of the things I appreciate about Henry Stapp is that he is absolutely not of that mindset. In fact, he thinks that consciousness is at the heart of everything, and physics has to accommodate it in some meaningful way.
We're talking about Henry there. How would you say, how would you characterize Henry Stapp's point of view in kind of a nutshell in terms of how, psi phenomena fits in?
Henry is he's a very conservative guy, basically, very open-minded, but rather careful about his public image. So, for example, he actually helped me to write the section of Chapter 9 of Irreducible Mind in which I describe his theory. And so when we got to the end of that exercise, I wrote to Henry and I said, Henry, listen, you've helped me a lot with this. I need to acknowledge you in some way. No, don't do that. He was not distant from the field at that point, although he'd already had some, encounters with it on a, private basis. Well, in his chapter in Beyond Physicalism, he talks openly about how his theory could potentially accommodate essentially everything we talked about in Irreducible Mind, including survival. And he comes right out and says, there's nothing in the concept of survival that's inherently incompatible with quantum mechanics. So I would prefer to let Henry speak for himself in terms of saying how it will do this. I'm comfortable with some of it, not all of it. He struggles with PK and Joseph. I mean, part of my reason for bringing up Joseph is that in the context of developing beyond physicalism, we took two psi phenomena as being especially challenging for theoreticians, and those are macro PK and precognition. True precognition. So Henry struggled a lot with Joseph, hasn't quite come to terms with him yet, doesn't dispute probably the reality of the phenomena, but isn't quite sure how his own theory can accommodate that. And by the way, I should say his way of accommodating true precognition is, to me, less believable even than his way of dealing with PK. It basically involves, in quantum mechanics, the future doesn't exist. So you have to make the present gravitate toward the future in order to have precognition. And that's the way he kind of goes about it. And he allows for the possibility of some help from whatever it is that lies at the bottom of the entire cosmic process.
Interesting. Carlos, of course, has asked, did you find any data from psychical research that is not consistent with the disciplines touched on in Beyond Physicalism?
Well, I think it's kind of up in the air at the moment. I mean, what we get to is not so much a theory as a kind of generic theoretical orientation. It's technically called evolutionary panentheism, which is a view that Mike Murphy has been promoting through Esalen and CTR for 50 years, basically, which he got through Aurobindo. But one of the other chapters in the book that I haven't mentioned is one by myself and David Presti. The chapter by David and myself is about the psychobiology of transmission models. It's preceded, incidentally, by a really, I think, quite excellent chapter by Mike Grosso looking at the whole kind of world history of transmission-like theories. And they go back to pre-Socratic times, and they include a lot of really illustrious figures in intellectual history. But then we start bearing down on things by having David and me summarize what's presently known, not a whole lot, about the possible psychobiology of transmission models and the relations of psychobiology to psi, mystical experience, and genes as the three kind of core phenomena that we're interested in. The idea is that all of these things are potentially encompassed within a transmission type model that says we're much more complicated than we normally experience ourselves to be. We have deeper resources that we normally don't have access to, but which we can access either fortuitously or through systematic work of various kinds. And how can we begin to think about all that biologically? And I think we get to a kind of nice place in there which makes it clear that there's plenty of research to be done. I mean, research on Asian, for example, psychedelics, which is now re-emerging after decades of, languishing in the shadows thanks to federal regulations. It's coming back, and it's already basically replicating and extending a lot of the exciting findings that were coming out back in the 60s and, 50s and 60s, really. So all that bodes well, I think, for further progress, which will help us to clarify what it is that needs to be explained and how we can, what kind of a theoretical structure may help us explain it.
Cheryl is asking, are there any interesting studies or experiments going on at the Division of Perceptual Studies these days?
She planted that question. She's been working, she's one of a number of people that Ross Gunseith has been working with. Ross has I've been writing books for 15 years. Ross has actually been working in the lab and getting stuff done. And he's developed a set of novel PK detectors. I won't attempt to describe what they are, but they're, the main ones are sort of extremely high input impedance amplifiers that can detect tiny little effects like appearances of charge at their surfaces and things of that sort. And these, we think, are moving us from the arena of standard kind of RNG experiments, where you have lots of events occurring, it's very hard to tell where anything is happening. These are events that occur substantially more commonly in the presence of motivated subjects, and they occur at well-defined points in time. I mean, ideally for us, what we did is adjust a Cupertino who's just standing there, and suddenly something happens that would never happen in the history of the world unless he was doing something very special, and then he rises off the ground. Well, we're certainly not to that stage, but we think that Ross's work has kind of got us partway in that direction. So he's got some people who are consistently affecting these devices, and it's completely integrated with our EEG neuroimaging setup, where we can record up to 128 channels of EEG and a bunch of other physiological stuff in strict time synchrony with the output of the various detector devices. And, another thing we'd like to do with the same kind of setup is to study persons who can voluntarily leave their bodies and go to a pre-agreed upon remote location. In fact, in our lab, we've got a satellite room that's upstairs and across the hall as far as we can get it from the lab. So if we had somebody who could come in, we'd wire that person up, have them in our shielded room and recording while he or she travels to the remote location. There can be detectors there and targets there, so we can verify whether something actually gets there and learn something, and also find out what's been going on back home, so to speak.
So Carlos is saying no chance of getting Cupertino into the lab? Or a Cupertino?
Well, we don't know of any right now, but if anybody hears about one, bring them on. I am in touch, though, with a guy who's currently down in Austin, Texas. He's the most serious student of the Yoga Sutras I've ever seen. I mean, he knows the whole thing in Sanskrit, recites it a couple of times a day, devotes most of his waking hours to his sadhana, and has already gotten to where he can pretty reliably get into some very unusual states, apparently, and has promised me that as part of his sadhana, he will attempt to master one or more of the cities, including this one, which is where you rise up from the mud or thorns, I forget which one it is, in Book 3 of the Yoga Sutras, by meditating on an upward current in the body or something of that sort. So we can imagine, having the chair in our shielded room sitting on a scale that sends an output over to the computer, and we can, measure his weight down to a fraction of an ounce or something like that. And once he masters the city, he doesn't have to actually get out of the chair altogether in order for us to be able to tell that he's having some success.
Oh, very interesting. The rest of the group, outside the neuroimaging laboratory, what else is going on at Dow?
Well, the main things, thank you for asking. Jim Tucker, of course, is carrying on Ian's work, and he gave a talk. So that probably carries the burden for that. But the main thing is Jim is focusing mainly on American cases, which circumvent a lot of the traditional difficulties seized upon by would-be critics, about translators and getting there on time, or, getting records before the families meet, things of that sort. So he's published several really excellent American cases in his recent book, Return to Life. Bruce Grayson is now officially retired, but that means he can work more on our stuff when he wants to. And he has begun writing a book about NDEs. Bruce has both Jim and Bruce have huge databases. There are something upwards of 2,000 court cases now coded in a big database with a couple hundred variables. And Bruce has something like 1,000 NDE cases also coded on. He's got his own coding scheme of 300 or something variables. And we're really just at the point where we can begin to use these databases to begin to construct and test models of the respective phenomena. For example, in the in the court database, there's a tremendously scattered distribution of the time between death of the previous personality and the arrival of a new one. Well, might there be things in the database that predict the length of that interval? Or, for example, the number and accuracy of memories and that sort of stuff. And in recent decades, statisticians have worked out lots of great techniques for doing this kind of ANOVA-like stuff on qualitative data. So that's an area of our work that's sure to develop a lot in the next few years, I think. Let's see, what else? Emily is in quasi-retirement, as you know, right at the moment. But I'm hoping that we will shortly begin a big project involving deathbed studies. Spent a lot of time talking with hospice personnel, both here and other parts of the country. Out at Esalen, for example, we're in touch with hospices in New York, San Francisco, parts of Europe, and we have a lot of interest in trying to get going in that area because everything we've seen so far and everything we've heard from people who have worked in these kinds of places tells us that they're hotbeds of unusual happenings, and it's just a matter of trying to work out reasonable, ethical and productive research arrangements. Emily had already done a good bit of work toward laying the foundation for a program like that, and we hope to get it going pretty soon.
Allison is asking, I came in late, so please forgive me if I asked something that was already addressed. You mentioned current views on past, present, and future. I was wondering if you could address the time slip phenomena.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
I was wondering if you could address the time slip phenomena.
Time slip?
Yeah, you know the kind of thing of like Andrew Mackenzie writes about in Adventures in Time, not just the Versailles experience, but other cases of individuals who felt that they walked across a threshold and ended up briefly in another time period.
Well, I personally don't know very much about that. I read a few of the famous cases, and I actually even encountered one here in a guy who went down to the Monroe Institute and had some peculiar experiences involving Confederate troops suddenly appearing on a back road in Nelson County.
Wow.
So, I think there's something to it, but I know very little about the subject and would hesitate even to talk about it more than
Yeah, calling it extreme of retrocognition. There are some really interesting cases.
In the garden at Versailles and all that.
Exactly. Yep. That one, and then Andrew Mackenzie has several in the book Adventures in Time. Some of them are pretty mild, seeing a house walking on a lonely road and then having that same type of feeling that the two women at Versailles had, where everything is quiet and moving in a different way, and it just feels very sort of unusual, surreal, and seeing a building and just keeping on with the walk, and the 2 days later, 3 days later, making the same walk, and there's nothing in that field. The house is gone. So it's an interesting thing. And what Allison was saying, that some people have been talking about some of the ghost and haunting cases being better explained by time slips.
Mm-hmm.
We've got about 5 minutes left. Brian, you've been very quiet. If you have a question, now's the time.
Is Brian out there? He's just produced a good monograph, an introduction to the psychobiology of psi. Definitely.
Yeah. Brian is typing, so we'll hang for a second and see what he has to say.
I'm looking at your list of questions, and I see there's one I've missed.
Okay.
How have the books been received? Well, it's interesting. Irreducible Mind, last time I looked, was selling about as well as it did when it first came out, and this is 8 years on. It's sold something over 10,000 copies, which, according to my sources, is really extraordinary for a book of that type. I mean, the thing is 800 and something pages long. There's not a picture in it. It's pretty dense in places, notably Chapter 4, Alan's chapter on memory, and other places as well. And we've generated something like $30,000 in royalty income for CTR.
Wonderful.
And all the royalties from both books to CTR, which of course paid the bills for all those meetings. Beyond physicalism, I'm not quite sure what's going on with it. I don't think it's getting as much notice as Irreducible Mind. I think it's a little too much for a lot of people. It's too far out. A bridge too far, you might say. It's sort of like Arnold in the Second World War. I mean, I think we're on the right track, and eventually that will become clear, but I think particularly for a lot of my more conservative scientific colleagues, they don't want to be going that far from the current sort of boundaries of the respectable.
They're probably happier hearing you ask questions than answer them. But we're going to help with that. This will be up on YouTube, and we're going to be publicizing the links to all the books for buy, as well as Book Expo. So we hope we can kick it up a notch for you guys.
Well, great.
What's next for the SLN group? Are you guys taking a brain break, or you got the next project in the thinking stage?
Well, we along the way in building this laboratory, which is now essentially complete, we also built a big suite of conventional ESP and PK experimental tasks that we couple with our physiology and so on. So we want to just look, our long run is for persons who have various kinds of unusual abilities, and by that I mean not just psi abilities, but abilities to get into unusual states that we, I think, suspect or in most cases know are psi-conducive, like transmediumship, deep hypnotic states, deep meditative states, things of that sort. So we're looking for good subjects, and I should say, I hate the word subjects. What we really mean is collaborators for our research, because we're just providing the kind of technical means to study things, and it's the people with the abilities who really matter the most at this stage.
Yeah, exactly. We have a couple of people typing, and I extended the time by 10 minutes, so we've got 11 minutes now. Shirley is saying, I almost OBE'd in your lab, but Ross stopped me. Bad Ross. Next time, don't let him do that. Don't worry, there will be other opportunities, Shirley, I'm sure. Margaret is also writing, and Brian has a thank you for writing the monograph to his, or forward to his monograph.
Yeah,
totally.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much. Margaret is saying thank you, great research, keep coming, and I think we are all really delighted, not necessarily with the tracking mechanism on your video camera, but there you go. But this look into the process behind both of the books, Irreducible Mind and Beyond Physicalism, what you guys have been doing over the last 17, 20 years, just so important at such a high level.
Let me say one more thing. I kind of forgot to get to the bottom line in terms of my own trajectory through this. What Irreducible Mind did for me, well, I have to go back to Gardner Murphy's book, Challenge of Psychical Research. He's got a great introduction to survival in there. And at the end of it, he talks about how it all looks to him, basically. And he speaks in terms of the irresistible force and the immovable object. The force being the evidence, the immovable object being the biological objection to survival. Then there's all these sort of a priori considerations and all the evidence that seems to point to the extreme dependence of mind on brain. For him, that was unresolvable, and at the time I started in parapsychology, I felt about the same about it. But Irreducible Mind altered that situation for me. I think we went a long way toward undermining the biological objection to survival. And let me just say in that context that most of you are probably aware of this huge book by Martin and Keith Augustin called The Myth of an Afterlife, also published ironically by Roman and Littlefield this year. It's under review through John Palmer's orchestrating some kind of a review of it, and that'll appear in the JP probably early next year sometime. But anyway, they rehearse ad nauseum all this sort of conventional stuff. But for me, a lot of that was, as I say, undermined by Irreducible Mind. So I really became much more sort of conceptually open to the possibility of survival. And the work on Beyond Physicalism has really carried that process a whole lot further for me. So that at this point, I'd say I'm not only open to the possibility, but I would say almost convinced of the reality of survival. And that's sure a long way from where I started, and that's all goes hand in hand with this sort of metaphysical transformation from a conventional physicalist to some kind of modern idealist.
Well, I'm glad you added that. That's very important. I think a lot of us who read that book, it did that for us too. You know, the arguments are very difficult to refute, and that's a very positive thing, I think. Anybody else have any more questions? Otherwise, I can't say enough how grateful we are that you agreed to do this, and how grateful we are for the work you've done for the last many decades. These two books are, I'm gonna get a little emotional here. These two books are extraordinarily important for the field, and I think are going to be at that level of importance for many decades to come.
Well,
so
now and round bricks in the edifice.
Yeah, well, it's a heck of a brick. It's like a cornerstone. It's really good. I think Myers would be very proud of all of you guys. Absolutely. Gone way beyond the master. Thank you so much, Ed, and thank you everybody for joining us. And as you know, we will be putting the recordings will be available, so if you want to come back and take a look, download this PowerPoint, you'll be able to get these links through to buy the book as well. And then I wanted to remind everybody that tomorrow at noon Eastern, we'll have Aileen Simmons on Aldous Huxley's hands. His, I think it's called His Perception, his own search for perception and the origin and resurgence of psychedelic science. And don't forget to watch the rest of the presentations if you're a new registrant to Book Expo. They're very good. And also, remember that the Paramook will be starting in January. We're now going to be pushing the start date back to Monday the 18th, and it will go probably the third week of February. And then on the weekend of January 23rd and 24th, the Parapsychology Foundation International Affiliates Conference will take place, and we have a number of very eminent speakers from among the Parapsychology Foundation International Affiliates list who will be joining us for those events, and there'll be more information about that. And the Parapsychology Foundation Online Academy will debut in 2016 as well to recognize the anniversary year. 2016 is the 65th anniversary. And Ed, when Lizette introduced you in November in the opening sequence, I just wanted to say that she described you as more than a friend and family member of the Parapsychology Foundation, given how far back you go in the hearts and in minds of the folks who have run the foundation over the years. So thank you again, and have a wonderful evening, and thanks everybody. I'm going to shut off the course right now, and we'll see you soon. Have a great day.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks.
Bye now.